this is Sally Ducharme, and thank you so much for joining me to explore the astrology of an event that occurred on this day in history. On November 19th, 1863, a crowd gathered at the Gettysburg battlefield in Pennsylvania in order to consecrate the land as a national cemetery. Abraham Lincoln had been asked to give a few concluding remarks at the end of this ceremony, and he would deliver in just 2 minutes what would come to be known as one of the most famous speeches of all time, the Gettysburg Address. Now, unfortunately, it's a myth that he scrawled a few lines on the back of the envelope on the train coming down to Gettysburg the day before. He had actually been working on this speech for a number of weeks before the event, and he did put some final finishing touches on it once he arrived in Gettysburg. The trains were pretty rickety at that time, and you would have been bounced around so much it would have been hard even to write a shopping list, let alone, this great enduring speech. And so when he rose to speak, I think by then people were kind of pretty cold. It had been, like 2 hours. I think they'd been going for like 2 hours. Someone gave a very long oration. And so at the time, Lincoln's remarks weren't much addressed. I think a few copies were made and distributed, but it wasn't until a few decades later, when the words of the Gettysburg Address were carved into the marble walls of the Lincoln Memorial, that people started really paying attention to what was said on this day and really appreciating the speech for its beauty, for its gravity, and for the power of its message. And so when we look at the astrology of this day when the speech was delivered, it's kind of interesting to see what was going on at that moment. We do not know exactly what time Lincoln rose to speak, but it was, historians agree, around 3 o'clock in the afternoon. So I set up a 3 p.m. chart in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. And so while the ascendant and midheaven degrees could vary, I would imagine, by a few degrees either way, I think the houses would stay in the whole sign system that I use. The houses would stay the same, even though if it was 10 minutes or 30 minutes earlier. Notice what is so striking about this chart is this huge Scorpio stellium. And you can see it's powered by Mars in its own sign of Scorpio, which in a sense is like the engine that's leading the train. And notice also on this day that the sun in Scorpio was conjunct the North Node, which indicates a strong life force. I don't know if you know anyone who has a sun conjunct North Node, but they're usually very notable for just what dynamic people they are. So on this day, this moment of the speech, there was that strong life force, something that's enduring. And of course, for a speech, you always look at Mercury. And Mercury at that time is kind of moving into a conjunction with the sun. It's what's called under the beams. And while some astrologers like to look upon that as kind of a weakness of Mercury, I tend to think about it as Mercury being pulled into that strong orbit of the sun, and that the divine impulse and that kind of strong spirit of the sun is using Mercury as its messenger. If you know anyone with Sun conjunct Mercury, you find that they usually are pretty intense and pretty focused on whatever it is they're doing or whatever message they want to convey. But another very notable thing about this stellium is that Mars was actually approaching almost exact a conjunction with Jupiter that day. You think about Jupiter as being the kind of the way people organize themselves, the ideals, the laws, the rules, different things in society that govern us, that keep us whole, and that help move us forward. Jupiter being a very beneficent planet. And so you've got this strong stellium. And when you think about the power of the Gettysburg Address, what was actually said on this day by Abraham Lincoln. He said, 7 years ago, just 87 years ago, a group of people decided for the first time in the whole history of mankind to create a government that was governed by free people. No kings, no leaders, no tyrants. People had chosen to govern themselves. And this is an experiment. This is something that's very fragile. And that unless the nation hangs together, unless this group of people pulls together, this experiment, this new thing that's leading humanity forward is going to be lost, will perish from the earth forever, were the words that he used. And so he was talking about the importance of this American experiment, but also he said, we cannot consecrate this hallowed ground any more than the people have who have died and been and suffered here for us. And so that very Scorpio sense that something needs to be broken, something needs to die in order to create something new. That the sacrifice of those who died and were wounded here, he said, will create a new freedom for mankind. So you can see that very Scorpio message in the Gettysburg Address around this idea of how human beings are governed. But yet that strong life force, this is something that's moving us forward. And what's really striking about what's happening with all of this Scorpio is that Pluto has been moving through Taurus at this time. And so we can see it's in opposition, especially to this exact opposition to this Mars-Jupiter conjunction. And this, in a sense, is a very archetypal symbol of what was the struggle going on in our nation at that time. You think about Pluto wealth, something deep and almost primal in the sign of Taurus, how we survive, how we thrive, how we eat, really. So dependent. And so people, the landed gentry, the people with land, the people with wealth, hanging on to that system that we can only survive, we can only eat, we can only move forward if we enslave other human beings to do all the work for us. So that sort of deep, deadly sin that's at the heart of the founding of America is represented by that Pluto in Taurus. And then in opposition is this Scorpio that says we need to break it down, that there's a higher truth, there's a deeper reality here, that human beings don't survive they don't survive by exploiting each other. They survive by living according to these ideals that were put into the founding of America, that all men are created equal, that we are given inalienable rights as individuals, and that one human being cannot own another. So you can see that struggle is represented on that day in the sky between the Scorpio and the Taurus Pluto. But I think another thing that's interesting about the astrology of this day is that we have Venus and Saturn. You can see at this time of day we're setting. You think about setting, that sunset time, that sort of golden sky where everything is emphasized and the shadows kind of align to create this beautiful light. And so Venus is in Libra, its own sign. And Saturn, it's approaching a conjunction to Saturn in Libra, where it's exalted. And so you think of the power of this speech, how beautiful it is, but simple, that Libra ideal of beautiful, like not an excess word. Every word was there for a purpose. And then that Saturn sense of gravity, of higher ideals, of reaching for something beyond what we have now, kind of reaching towards an ideal. So that powerful conjunction is also very prominently placed in this chart. And so if you look at this chart of the speech itself, it's always interesting then to take that moment and to put it together with the person actually delivering that speech. So we'll take Abraham Lincoln's chart and we'll put it with that moment of the Gettysburg Address. Now, unfortunately, Lincoln famously born in a log cabin. There weren't people writing down times of his birth. But astrologers over the years have worked with records, the few existing records there were about his birth, and it was said he was born at sunup. And so people have put together astrologers have used a sunrise chart for him. So we don't want to look at houses as exact working in this chart, but in any case, even if he was born anywhere around sunrise, that Scorpio stellium would be high above in his chart. So showing just his reaching for something in order to lead, in order to guide us. And notice that all that Scorpio is in square to that revolutionary sun. I always like squares as thinking as giving us action, kind of motivating us to act. And so you could see he was very full of the gravity of the occasion, but yet the power of that message was very strong in that revolutionary spirit of Abraham Lincoln. But also, what's interesting in this chart, comparing it with the moment with his natal chart, is notice that he's got, we made note of this Mars-Jupiter conjunction that's so powerful in his chart. And he was born with Mercury, the sign of the speechmaker, the communicator, with Pluto, giving him the ability to reach out to masses of people. And in Pisces, he's able to tap into a higher message, almost like a higher frequency. You think about Pisces as being kind of beyond the earth into another realm. So he's able to kind of reach out for this higher reality, this higher truth. And on this day, that powerful conjunction was in trine to his Mercury-Pluto conjunction in Pisces. So giving him the ability to deliver this very powerful message. But also we find out that on this day, his own, or Mercury itself, is at 20 degrees of Scorpio and is approaching a trine to that Jupiter. To speak to this universal truth is also really important on that day. But notice too, something else that was happening in his chart just kind of overall at that time. He was born with that revolutionary Aquarian sun in trine to Mars. So his ability to kind of have that future vision, to move things forward, and that Mars and Libra to connect with others about that message. Very strong in his chart. But notice what's happening with transiting Uranus at that time. I always think of Uranus as being kind of like downloads, these brilliant insights. And so Uranus was lining up in his chart on that day to create a grand air trine where he could bring that kind of that download, that sense of humanity can move itself forward in history, and that all the sacrifices made here are for that purpose, that he's able to pick up that message and put it into the chart of the Gettysburg Address. And notice, of course, even though we aren't exactly sure of the time, that ascendant is in Aries, give or take a few degrees. So creating that lovely kite, which I always think just kind of soars off into the atmosphere when you see that pattern in a chart. So you could see it was a very remarkable day in Abraham Lincoln's life as well. But the final thing I wanted to look at that really kind of knocked my socks off was if you look at what's called the U.S. Sibley chart, and this is a chart that's used by many astrologers to mark the birth of the United States of America on July 4th, 1776. And if you play with this chart, you'll find that it does work on many levels for different events that occur in our country. And so if you put the chart together, our Sibley chart together with the Gettysburg Address, I don't know what's happening here. And the first clue should be 7 years ago. 87 years ago is a signal for astrologers to know that that's the time of the third Saturn return in our lives. Notice, most people at 87 are leaving behind a lot of things about their earthly life. If not exactly dying, it's a time when their lives are becoming a lot more limited. And so you can see that what is happening on this day of the Gettysburg Address, but we are having our third Saturn return on this day. And notice, of course, Venus is here as well. So that powerful conjunction that shows the beauty and the power, and Saturn, the enduring quality of that speech, is reminding us of our ideals, that 11th house upon which our country was founded. And of course, in Libra, equality, fairness, another ideal is being reflected. But also, a Saturn return is a time when we have to let go of a phase of our lives. We have to close a chapter in order to open a new one, and a new chapter that brings us additional responsibility. And Abraham Lincoln in his Gettysburg Address pretty much says this, that, the dead have sacrificed for us. Our country is forever changed by this war. We can never go back. And so it's up to us, the living, to carry forward the work that these brave men have started for us. So it's interesting how much just the whole nature of the Saturn return is here in the words of the Gettysburg Address, and really in that time in America. And you think it won't be too much longer that Saturn will still be in Libra when Abraham Lincoln's assassinated. So it'll be the loss of a leader as well. And so that was one thing that's very remarkable about this Gettysburg Address placed in the Sibley chart of the United States. But notice too that powerful stellium in Scorpio is hidden in the 12th house of our chart. And that just shows the nature of the speech being hidden. It just kind of lies fallow for a number of decades before people start to understand, oh, this was a very moving, this was a very pivotal speech in our history. And so it was kind of in the nation's blind spot for a number of years. But yet you can see that deep struggle too between our 6th and 12th houses. It really went into the shadows of our nation's life, that we had been we were fighting a great war in order to preserve this union that guarantees liberty for all human beings. And so it's kind of interesting that this Gettysburg Address in Libra would not become well known until about 87 years later, when Saturn was making its third Saturn return to the Gettysburg Address, and Jupiter was there as well. That's when the Lincoln Memorial was dedicated, and this Gettysburg Address was carved into the walls. So it's always so fascinating, right, to look at astrology and what exactly, just how these planets are just speaking, almost singing these very deep and important meanings. And of course, we see also Scorpio is making wonderful trines to that essential nature of who we are, that Cancer nation that not only cares but thinks of itself as a family. Abraham Lincoln's appeal, a house divided itself against itself cannot stand, that we need to hold together as a people in order to preserve the ideals and guarantee the freedoms of our nation. And finally, the one thing that's also notable on this day was we have an Aquarian moon at 27 degrees of Aquarius. Remember, Abraham Lincoln has his sun at 24 degrees of Aquarius. So that revolutionary nature of Abraham Lincoln that believes in moving humanity forward, in bringing more freedom, more liberty, more equality to all human beings is very much that moon in our chart. Um, and so you can see on that day what is happening. Do you remember the Sun North Node conjunction on that day? That powerful life force. Notice that it's in square to that moon, and that the nodal axis, it's almost like it's pointing to that moon. I always think of the point of a T-square as like, you're pointing at something. And that kind of the man and the moment came together to point us towards that Aquarian moon and the ideals that it embodies. And so that also would explain, the great enduring power of the Gettysburg Address in our nation's life. So I don't know, looking at all of this astrology kind of gave me chills. It was just so amazing how the stars were aligning to create a great moment in the history of our country, a moment that recognized the past, but yet moved us forward as well. One thing that's kind of an interesting footnote, I was looking at that date, November 19th, 1863, and I thought, oh, that's 100 years from a very important date in American history, November 22nd, 1963. And so I looked up, what did they do on the 100th anniversary of the Gettysburg Address? And they did have a ceremony there, a great gathering again at Gettysburg to recognize the importance of the Gettysburg Cemetery, to honor the dead, but also to recognize the importance of that Gettysburg Address. President Kennedy was invited to come speak at the event, but he unfortunately had to decline because he had a campaign event scheduled in Texas. And so former President Eisenhower appeared and spoke. So it's kind of interesting to speculate in history, isn't it? What if the people managing President Kennedy's calendar had prioritized recognizing the importance of Gettysburg and the Gettysburg Address over the need to be reelected in 1964? Just interesting to speculate. But in any case, thank you so much for joining me to take this trip back in history, and I look forward to talking to you again.